Hello, hello. I'm just going to move my microphone. Sorry, I've just realised it's staring at me from the wrong place. So I'm going to mute it for a minute so it's not too thumpy and noisy for you. And then we shall be back with talking in a moment. Right, there we go. I've been doing this, would you believe it, for almost continuously for the last 2 years. Not quite. There was a section in the middle, well, near the beginning where I stopped, but I've been actually using a microphone for at least a year. I should know what I'm doing with it and have it ready, shouldn't I? I've got the document up that I'm supposed to have up. I suppose that's brownie points. Anyway, so what are we up to? We are reading the fourth session of Emily of New Moon, written by the famous L.M. Montgomery. That's Lucy Maud Montgomery, Canadian lady who... Yes, it's a big streamer mood. There's a lot of us like that. I do actually have a checklist for things to do when I'm getting ready to stream, but you know, so much for that. Anyway, so what I was going to say was, I love being able to chat with people when they're here and they're chatting. Although when I'm actually reading, I don't tend to respond to the chat directly. But Lucy Maud Montgomery, a Canadian lady, famous for having written the Anne of Green Gables books, humongous series, which I shall not be reading. Maybe one day in the future, but for now I am reading Emily of New Moon, which is my favourite of her books. And it's a completely different lead character, this girl called Emily. And from what I've understood, which I found out when I was an adult, not when I was actually in my teens and reading it, Emily has a lot more of Maud's personal, experiences and points of view than the Anne books did. Yes, and please feel free to lurk. And I'm not just talking to Shadow, which is great to see you here. I know that you're often here anyway, but even if nobody speaks in the chat, that's fine. But if you want to, and if there's a bunch of people who want to chat together while I'm reading, that's really cool. I love it when there's a little bit of conversation going on, a little bit of community being built. While I'm actually reading, I will attempt to actually stick to the book I'm reading. Although there will be lots of asides where I'm talking about things I've learnt along the way or life experiences I've had and all that sort of hoo-ha. Just because that's usually what happens and that's where an ADHD mind like my one goes. But between chapters, at the beginning of a stream and at the end of the stream, I do tend to chat. And sometimes a lot longer than I really probably ought to. But hey, there are people who really enjoy that. It's just part of it. Yes, lots of fun anecdotes. And just by the by, if you don't mind me asking, have you actually been over to Prince Edward Island at all? I don't know if I have or not. And I can't actually ask my mother now because my mother is now in a rest home for people who have lost the ability to communicate and are not quite there anymore. So that's been a lot of what's been keeping me busy over the last 2 months, is getting that sort of side of things sorted out. My aunt, her sister, has and used to regularly go there to play violin for a little string quartet or something that she was part of. So I may have done when we went and visited her when I was really, 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 really little. Just like me being part of a Canadian Halloween thing and all sorts of stuff like that, which nothing like the way it happens in New Zealand, or doesn't happen if it comes to Halloween. Going and seeing the relatives who do maple syruping, although not at the time of year when they were doing it. What other things? Yeah, so I've got a bunch of relatives over in Canada. I used to say from one side of Canada to the other. Well, they're mainly on one side and on the other, not so much in between although a little bit more nearer to the Great Lakes, but not sort of further across where um, one of our dear listeners actually has family has come from. So anyway, right. It's one of the maritime states. If it was an American, that's what they'd refer to it as. But it's a big island, a lot bigger than most of the islands that I'm used to, except for our New Zealand main islands of North Island and South Island, obviously. Um, I think doing a trans-Canada trip would be absolutely wonderful. And one of the ways I would like to do it, at least part, is actually on something. I don't know if there's a Canadian version of the Rocky Mountain Explorer, which I think is American, but if there was, that would be wow, I would love it. I did find years ago, when I was obviously a lot younger, that when you're traveling by train, it's a lot less tiring than if you're traveling by bus or other road. Flying would be really cool. Train would be really cool. I've done a little snippet of both of those last time I was in Canada, coming back from England actually, where most of my anecdotes are usually based as when we were living in England. Just because most of my books up until now have actually been English books, not English language only, but actually English. So yeah, it would be really, really cool to actually do a trans-Canada trip. I think there's probably quite a few people who do the Trans-America ones, but I think a Trans-Canada one would be even more awesome. And I do remember flying when we were flying over that there are some regions within the different provinces that as we were flying across this trees, like these ones down the bottom here, these sort of looking trees, sort of whatever they are. And as we were looking down, you could see all this water shining. It's not like the trees were in a lake, but there was just like little tiny patches of water everywhere, and then little wee miniature islands with these trees on it. And it was just like, oh my goodness, that's wet down there. And I had no idea just how lakey, I suppose it was, some of those areas are without getting into the great big huge Great Lakes aspect of lakes. So yeah, that would be a really great way to do it. Fly into LA, road trip up to San Francisco, fly up to Vancouver, train across the country, that sort of stuff would be fabulous. I do remember at one stage when it was a family trip, not my own immediate family, but when I was growing up, my family then, so it was my parents and my brothers and me, rather than my husband and my children and me, we actually flew out to New Zealand from Vancouver, which was really cool at the time. It wasn't quite so commonly done, I think, but all my trips since then have been via LA, just because it seems to be the major hub for anything like that. I did do a train trip from Vancouver down to Seattle. No. I did a train trip back up. We did a bus trip from Vancouver down to Seattle, stayed with some friends just out of Seattle. Lake Sammamish, I think it's called. I used to call it Lake Sammamish, and then she laughed, and apparently it's not, it's Lake Sammamish. They lived around there, which is very urban, but also very lakey, rural type thing. Houses around the edges of these lakes, which we don't do so much in New Zealand because we have horrendous rainfall in a lot of places, and it's just one of those strange things that, well, because we're so aware that we get flooding so easily, we tend to not build right on top of a waterway. Oh no, you need to go and get your New Zealand passport renewed when you can. Well, you won't lose yours, but yeah, get it ready for whenever it is that you're going to be able to use it. You don't want to be having to wait for it. I actually only have one passport. I once upon a time, I think, could have qualified for getting an English one, which back when they were part of the EU would have been a really cool thing to do. It's probably not so useful now, getting one, just because my mum was born over there, that there's a possibility that I could have got one. Yeah, my mum was born in England, but she then moved fairly soon because that was right as war was starting, Second World War. She was born right before midnight. Second World War was declared just after midnight. Imagine being a woman giving birth in a hospital with your gas mask handy right next to you, because everyone has said as soon as war is declared, Hitler is going to start dropping gas bombs, because that's what they thought was going to happen. And you're in hospital and you're having a baby, and it's a really uncomfortable, hard time. And that would be just, anyway. So that was how my mum came into the world. And then after a few years, when they were able to, not too many years, they actually went across to, by ship, my mum and her brother, and my mum and her brother and her mum, went across to Canada. And it was one of the last boats that was actually able to go out with civilians, as far as I know, to Canada at the time. And they were able to do that because my mother's father was Canadian. He's now dead, long dead, was Canadian. And so therefore they lived in Canada, and he also had travelled across, not immediately at the same time, but because of an issue with his knee, not being able to bend it, he wasn't able to fly in the Air Force during the Second World War, but he was able to go back to Canada and train up the pilots. He was allowed to train, even if he wasn't actually allowed to fly over Europe. So there you go. That's a little bit of random information for you. Anyway, so yeah, I do want to get to Prince Edward Island, have a bit of a poke around, a bit of a look around. I probably won't do the Anne of Green Gables type tourist trail, just because don't tend to be quite so much into that sort of thing where there's lots and lots of others who are going, unless it's something where I actually find a little unique edge that I thoroughly enjoy. Hi, Grandma. Good to see you here too. I'm just yakking before I start reading my story, which is what I mainly spend my time. Well, actually, I do a bit of both. I talk a lot longer than most people do who are the readers. Anyway, so not a problem, Shadow. It's great to have you here. Loving having you here. Yes, and hopefully you'll get to do that trip someday too, and see or not see, it's up to you, various rallies on the way. I will do the same. Yeah. Yes, Grandma, I transfer my reading videos after I've cropped them, so it's just the actual video window over to YouTube 2 weeks after I've read them. This is just a bit of random information. I'm using Grandma as the excuse to actually share the information for anyone else who's listening who doesn't know. I transfer them over to YouTube and then put them into playlists for each of the books that I read. And I have people who follow me over there who regularly listen to them, who don't have anything to do with Twitch, just it's not something that they relate to, I suppose. Strange. But one of the things that they apparently enjoy is me just nattering like this and being all sort of random and waving my hands around and all that sort of stuff, that's good. Just be yourself. That's the way. That's I think what most of us need to learn to do a lot more of, being ourselves. And yes, I am looking at my second monitor, and I'm hoping that, just looking at the gauges that I've got on it, oh dear, I'm just going to pause a moment in my inane chatter and wait for my processor to catch up, because it's running, all 4 cores are at 100%, and I don't want it to drop the stream. I moved something. It didn't like it. But we'll be back to full speed in a minute, I hope. And yes, I am eventually going to get this hard drive out of this computer and put it into my replacement computer, which is sitting on the floor with the alternative almost square type monitor, really old but works well, monitor sitting on top of it as my backup for keeping an eye on things in case this one really decides to throw a hissy fit and I have to just shut my browser. It's easier if it's just here like this instead of having to look right over there. Anyway, we look like things are improving slightly, I think. And I think we're probably ready to actually get on with reading our story. So I I'm going to introduce myself because I usually remember to. Hi, if you're new here, I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's stories because, well, why not? Actually, I like them because there's stuff I grew up with. I grew up reading books that my parents and my grandparents had all read when they were growing up, often reading the same actual physical books that they had. Hang on. Such as this one here, which actually I didn't read this one when I was growing up because my dad only just dug it out of a box the other day, so I've been reading it since then. But this is one that his dad had received as a Sunday school prize back in the days when they used to do that sort of thing. And he still has it, so he's passed it on to me. I may or may not read that one sometime. Yeah, I grew up reading all this sort of stuff, and as you've heard already, I have a lot of weirdo family life experience, grandfather from Canada. Grandmother was actually from New Zealand, but had gone over to England because her brothers had won scholarships to go to university over there. So the whole family decamped to England. And the boys went to, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure they all went to Cambridge. Maybe one of them went to Oxford. I don't know, but they were definitely the Oxbridge type. And my grandmother actually completed her secondary school training and then went on and did her music degree while she was over there. And I'm not too sure if that may have been the London College of Music, which at that stage was a really very important place to do your music degree through. And because of that, when she eventually came back to New Zealand on her own with 3 children, she got a job as a music teacher at a secondary school because she had her degree in music, not just teacher's training in music with some experience. She actually got paid a bit more, which is just as well because, I mean, we didn't have any benefits for women living on their own looking after children back then. So, yeah, lots of weirdo life experience. I've got an English aunt and I've got all these other sorts of things. Oh, yeah, my English aunt, she lived in China for 7 years before it became a communist country. And we used to go up and stay. I used to go up and stay with her, and we would create these wonderful Chinese feasts, and then invite the rest of my family up to have the feast once we got all the dishes prepared over the day or 2 days previously. And it was wonderful. And hearing all these things that she had experienced, she had some, and she was a storyteller. Man, was she a storyteller. It was wonderful. Anyway, so yeah, that's a little bit more detail than my usual hi, this is who I am intro, but there you go. You never know what you're going to get into. So I do have a few tips. Get yourself something to drink, your favourite drink if you want. Otherwise, make sure you've got some water so you stay hydrated. It's great for the brain. It keeps your body working well too. Something to snack on. And my snack of the day today is the New Zealand snack log. This variety is white chocolate and raspberry. Yum, my favourite at the moment. Because they don't have it. I have it, well, not locally. They used to do one that was called apricot. And it was just the granola or muesli bar with no chocolate or carob or anything. Yes, it's very rapid. Just the chocolate or muesli bar like this, but with none of this on the back, which the weird colour. That's white chocolate. They used to do one that was just the actual muesli bar. Very yum. Sesame seeds and rolled oats and coconut and all sorts of things. So, yeah, drink, snack. Third thing, I remembered, chair, comfortable seat, unless you want to lie on the floor, or if you're doing housework or work or studying and you need to do that, that's okay. You can carry on with doing that and have a listen to me buzzing away in your ear if you want to. But if you're not, if you're just actually enjoying having some stories read to you, get yourself somewhere comfortable to sit. And get ready, and we're going to start reading. And for some reason, my phone is showing me something, and I have no idea why. So I shall get that out of the way and make sure I've got the sound turned down on it so it's not talking to me like it was last time. And find, yes, this is all stuff that's meant to have been done, that's on my list that I forget to read every time. I shall just open up my Twitch on my phone just because sometimes I notice things on that I don't notice on the three big, huge screens around me. Anyway, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Right. Who wants to listen to the story? Let's read the next chapter of Emily of New Moon. This is Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery, who is famous for having written Anne of Green Gables. This is chapter 7. I'm getting better at reading the Roman numerals out loud. I used to have to work them out even though I knew what they were. Chapter 7, The Book of Yesterday. Right, here we go. That first Saturday and Sunday at New Moon always stood out in Emily's memory as a very wonderful time. So crowded was it with new and generally delightful impressions. If it be true that we count time by heart-throbs, quote, I have no idea where from, Emily lived 2 years in it instead of 2 days. Everything was fascinating from the moment she came down the long, polished staircase into the square hall that was filled with a soft, rosy light coming through the red glass panes of the front door. For those who are new here or need a refresher, Emily's father died. She has been argued over by her dead mother's relatives as to who was going to look after her and take responsibility, because none of them wanted to. They drew lots. Well, she had to draw lots. And she's now living at this property called New Moon. And this is her first actual day there. It's her first morning there. She's just come downstairs and discovering what the place is like. So we see how it goes. Emily gazed through the panes delightedly. What a strange, fascinating red world Did I say I get lost in a sentence? I also stumble, and don't ask me to do accents. They're a mess. Emily gazed through the panes delightedly. What a strange, fascinating red world she beheld, with a weird red sky that looked, she thought, as if it belonged to the Day of Judgment. There was a certain charm about the old house which Emily felt keenly and responded to, although she was too young to understand it. It was a house which aforetime had had vivid brides and mothers and wives, and the atmosphere of their lives and loves still hung around it, not yet banished by the old maidishness of the regime of Elizabeth and Laura. Those are the two spinster sisters who are the ones taking responsibility for her. Why, I'm going to love New Moon, thought Emily, quite amazed at the idea. Aunt Laura was setting the breakfast table in the kitchen, which seemed quite bright and jolly with the glow of the morning sunshine. Even the black hole in the ceiling had ceased to be spookish and became only a commonplace entrance to the kitchen loft. She'd seen it at night and it seemed rather creepy. And on the red sandstone doorstep, Saucy Sal, her cat, was sitting, preening her fur as contentedly as if she had lived at New Moon all her life. Emily did not know it, but Sal had already drunk deep the delights of battle with her peers that morning, and taught the barn cats their place, once and for all. Cousin Jimmy's big yellow tomcat had got a fearful drubbing, and was minus several bits of his anatomy, while a stuck-up black lady cat who fancied herself considerably had made up her mind that if that grey and white narrow-faced interloper from goodness knew where was going to stay at New Moon, she was not. Emily gathered Sal up in her arms and kissed her joyously, to the horror of Aunt Elizabeth, who was coming across the platform from the cookhouse with a plate of sizzling bacon in her hands. "Don't ever let me see you kissing that cat again," she ordered. "Oh, all right," agreed Emily cheerfully. "I'll only kiss her when you don't see me after this." She's a smart one. She's fairly sharp. She has grown up with just her father's company, and she didn't go to school. She has read lots of her dad's books, I think, from what I remember, and she hasn't learned the niceties of social norms that were current at the time, or even the slightly older-fashioned ones, which her aunts or great aunts, her aunts are used to. And so there's going to be, as you can already tell, there's going to be a lot of clashing. Anyway, but she's also clever enough to actually recognise the Yeah, sorry, my chair is wiggling around. I'm not yet on a standing desk. I don't have that capacity yet. She has the ability to recognize when an adult says something and takes it literally, when the adult means it figuratively. And adults often don't realize how often they say something in a very figurative manner. We are used to using words as shortcuts to something, and a child who is clever enough will often recognize what it literally means and then get confused because they have got in trouble for taking it literally, because supposedly they're meant to know what it means. Anyway, let's carry on reading. We'll get less interruptions as we go through because I'll get more caught up in the story. So whatever. Oh, all right, agreed Emily cheerfully. I'll only kiss her then when you don't see me after this. I don't want any of your pertness, miss. You are not to kiss cats at all. But Aunt Elizabeth, I didn't kiss her on her mouth, of course. I just kissed her between her ears. It's nice. Won't you just try it for once and see for yourself? That will do, Emily. You have said quite enough. And Aunt Elizabeth sailed on into the kitchen majestically, leaving Emily momentarily wretched. She felt that she had offended Aunt Elizabeth, and she hadn't the least notion why or how. But the scene before her was too interesting to worry long over Aunt Elizabeth. Delicious smells were coming from the cookhouse, a little slanted roof building at the corner where the big cooking stove was placed in summer. So, sorry, I'm just going to get my chair a little bit better sorted so I'm not shouting at you, and also my chair isn't trying to run away. I don't know if you've ever lived anywhere which has an outside kitchen and an inside kitchen, or even just an outside kitchen. I've been to several different places over the years where if the climate is really hot and it's all the time, they will actually have the cooking place separate from the main living place. Part of it is heat, build-up of heat from cooking. You don't want that where you're living. And also because often in those places that are hot all the time, tropical places and so on, rats, mice, various other bugs, critters, creepy crawlies, things that are attracted to food, you don't want them inside your house. And so therefore you keep them isolated by having all your cooking preparation and your meals done in a place where they are not going to come into the house. It's clean while you're actually using it. You get it all clean and you use the space. But then when you go across to your house, you're not having all those critters following you and invading your home. Now, if you live somewhere where it's hot in summer and then cold in winter, then it will be more a matter of you have your outside cooking space or your separate kitchen for cooking in when it's hot weather, so the house itself doesn't get too hot. And also you don't have the smell of the cooking going right through the house, because in hot weather those smells tend to permeate a lot more. I'm not sure why. It's something to do with the heat of the air. Those smells become a lot more available. And then in winter, you move back into cooking in the small kitchen that's inside the main house, or smaller kitchen inside the main house. Sometimes it's a bigger one, because back in the days of servants, you had big spaces for that sort of thing. Maybe. Anyway, we'll carry on. So she's describing what would have been a summer kitchen. Where are we? Delicious smells were coming from the cookhouse, a little slant-roofed building at the corner where the big cooking stove was placed in summer. It was thickly overgrown with hop vines, as most of the New Moon buildings were. Hops are used for flavouring beer. Although I don't think Aunt Elizabeth is really into beer. Why is she growing hops? Good question. We'll find out. As most of the New Moon buildings were. To the right was the new orchard, very wonderful now in blossom, but rather a commonplace spot, after all, since Cousin Jimmy cultivated it in most up-to-date fashion and had grain growing in the wide spaces between the straight rows of trees that looked all alike. But on the other side of the barn lane, just behind the well, was the old orchard, where Cousin Jimmy said the columbines grew, which seemed to be a delightful place where trees had come up at their own sweet will and grown into individual shapes and sizes, where blue-eyed ivy twined about their roots and wild briar roses rioted over the grey paling fence. Straight ahead, closing the vista between the orchards, was a little slope covered with huge white birches, among which were the new moon barns, and beyond the new orchard a little lovable red road looped lightly up and up over a hill until it seemed to touch the vivid blue of the sky. So you can feel what it's like there from her descriptions, and the heart rise that Emily's got with looking at all this wonderful new place that she's living. Cousin Jimmy came down from the barns carrying brimming pails of milk, and Emily ran with him to the dairy behind the cookhouse. Such a delightful spot she had never seen or imagined. It was a snow-white little building in a clump of tall balm of gileads, plant of some sort, trees, I'm guessing. Sorry, balm. Yeah, you can look that one up and then type it in the chat. Type it in the chat for me if you want, and then I'll read it out. And thank you. Yes, I try to contextualize if I have anything that I can add to the understanding of a story. Its grey roof was dotted over with cushions of moss like fat green velvet mice. You went down 6 sandstone steps with ferns crowding about them and opened a white door with a glass panel in it, and went down 3 more steps, and then you were in a clean, earthy-smelling, damp, cool place with an earthen floor and windows screened by the delicate emerald of young hop vines, and broad wooden shelves all around, whereupon stood wide, shallow pans of glossy brownware. That means it was glazed, sort of like terracotta, but it's glazed. Glossy brownware. Brownware being brown pottery with brown glaze on it, like the teapot my grandmother used to have. You might have had a grandmother with that sort of teapot. That sort of brown. Glossy brownware, full of milk, coated over with cream so rich that it was positively yellow. Aunt Laura was waiting for them, the buckets of milk, and she strained the milk into the empty pans and then skimmed some of the full ones. Emily thought skimming was a lovely occupation and longed to try her hand at it. She also longed to sit right down and write a description of that dear dairy, not diary. But alas, there was no account book. She'd burned it because Aunt Elizabeth had insisted on being able to read it. No secrets from me, said Aunt Elizabeth. That was in the previous video, which you can actually, once we're finished here, you can go and have a listen to. But there was no account book. Still, she could write it in her head. She squatted down on a little 3-legged stool in a dim corner and proceeded to do it, sitting so still that Jimmy and Laura forgot her and went away, and later had to hunt for her for 1/4 of an hour. This delayed breakfast and made Aunt Elizabeth very cross. But Emily had found just the right sentence to define the clear yet dim green light that filled the dairy, and was so happy over it that she didn't mind Aunt Elizabeth's black looks a bit. After breakfast, Aunt Elizabeth informed Emily that henceforth it would be one of her duties to drive the cows to pasture every morning. Jimmy has no hired man just now, and it will save him a few minutes. And don't be afraid, added Aunt Laura. The cows know the way so well they'll go of themselves. You have only to follow and shut the gates. I'm not afraid, said Emily, but she was. She knew nothing about cows. Still, she was determined that the Murrays, that's her mother's side of the family who she's living with, that the Murrays should not suspect a star was scared. Okay, so the Murrays and the stars. The Murrays, there is nothing wrong with us. We are the people who really know how life ought to be lived. We are the ones who have a say in the way the community runs and all this sort of thing. And we will not have any of this fun nonsense around here. Thank you very much. And the fact that one of our number chose to marry a star, of all people, that's quite beyond belief. And enough said. That gives you the idea of the dynamics. So Emily's mother had left her family and gone and married Emily's father and been shunned by her family. She had then died a number of years later, and Emily's father had brought her up, and now he has died of TB consumption. And so Emily's mother's family have taken her on to look after and raise her because, yeah, she's part of their family. Not that they're really happy about that. But anyway, we'll get there. We'll get there. It's gonna be hard work. It's going to be stretching, but it's not just going to be hard for Emily because she is going to challenge them. You know that, don't you? With someone who thinks as clearly as she does and with such a strong mind, she will challenge them. And I'm hoping that Aunt Elizabeth will actually rise to the challenge and grow herself instead of just always doing things this way. Anyway, we'll carry on. She was determined that the Murrays should not suspect a star was scared. So, her heart beating like a trip hammer, she sallied valiantly forth and found that what Aunt Laura had said was true, and cows were not such ferocious animals after all. They're just really big, which is scary when you're little. They went gravely on ahead, and she only had to follow, through the old orchard and then through the scrub maple growth beyond, along a twisted ferny path where the Wind Woman was purring and peeping through the maple clumps. The Wind Woman is one of her imaginary friends. Emily loitered by the pasture gate until her eager eyes had taken in all the geography of the landscape. The old pasture ran before her in a succession of little green bosoms right down to the famous Blair Water, an almost perfectly round pond with grassy, sloping, treeless margins. Beyond it was the Blair Water Valley, filled with homesteads, and further out the great sweep of the white-capped Gulf, which means it's windy out there. It seemed to Emily's eyes like a charming land of green shadows and blue waters. Down in one corner of the pasture, walled off by an old stone dyke, was the little private graveyard where the dead and gone Murrays were buried. Emily wanted to go and explore it, but was afraid to trust herself in the pasture. "I'll go as soon as I get better acquainted with the cows," she resolved. Off to the right, on the crest of a steep little hill covered with young birches and firs, was a house that puzzled and intrigued Emily. It was grey and weather-worn. Sorry, I'm writing a word down because I want to tell you all about it. Yes, more background. But I want to carry on with the story so we don't lose the flow, so I'm writing it down. It was grey and weather-worn, but it didn't look old. It had never been finished. The roof was shingled, but the sides were not, and the windows were boarded over. Why had it never been finished? And it was meant to be such a pretty little house, a house you could love, a house where there would be nice chairs and cosy fires and bookcases and lovely, fat, purry cats and unexpected corners. There and then she named it the Disappointed House. And many an hour thereafter did she spend finishing that house, furnishing it as it should be furnished, and inventing the proper people and animals to live in it. To the left of the pasture field was another house of a quite different type, a big old house tangled over with vines, flat-roofed, with mansard windows and a general air of indifference and neglect about it. A large untidy lawn, overgrown with unpruned shrubs and trees, straggled right down to the pond, where enormous willows drooped over the water. Emily decided that she could ask Cousin Jimmy about these houses when she got a good chance. Just a reminder, and also for those of you new here, Cousin Jimmy is of the same generation as the others, but he's considered to be rather simple because he had an injury to his head, and I think it was when he was born, but I'm not sure. It may have been after that. So technically, because he's had brain damage, they all think that he's rather not with it. I think he allows them to think that. because he's shown that he's a little sharper in some ways and a lot more observant than most of them. I think he gets a lot of the way he likes life to be by carrying on with this charade. But we'll find out through the story. Not today, but somewhere along the line. I'm pretty sure we're going to find out something along those lines. We'll carry on with the story. She would ask Cousin Jimmy about these houses when she got a good chance. She felt that before she went back, she must slip along the pasture fence and explore a certain path which she saw entering the grove of spruce and maple further down. She did, and found that it led straight into fairyland. Along the bank of a wide, lovely brook, a wild, dear little path, with lady ferns beckoning and blowing along it, the shyest of elfin June bells under the firs, and little whims of loveliness at every curve. She breathed in the tang of fir balsam, and saw the shimmer of gossamers high up in the boughs, and everywhere the frolic of elfin lights and shadows. Here and there the young maple branches interlaced as if to make a screen for dryad faces. Emily knew all about dryads, thanks to her father. And the great sheets of moss under the trees were meet for Titania's couch. Met the requirements. "This is one of the places where dreams grow," said Emily happily. She wished the path might go on forever, but presently it veered away from the brook, and when she had scrambled over a mossy old board fence, she found herself in the front garden of New Moon, where Cousin Jimmy was pruning some spirea bushes. Can't remember what spirea bushes are. I don't think that's buddleia. I think it's something else. You can look that one up too. And maybe even tell me if it's got any other common names, if you think it's something that others of us might recognise. "Oh, Cousin Jimmy, I've found the dearest little road," said Emily breathlessly. "Coming up through Lofty John's bush," he said. "Isn't it our bush?" asked Emily, rather disappointed. "No, but it ought to be. 50 years ago, Uncle Archibald sold that jog of land to Lofty John's father, old Mike Sullivan. He built a little house down near the pond and lived there till he quarrelled with Uncle Archibald, which wasn't long, of course. Then he moved his house across the road, and Lofty John lives there now. Elizabeth has tried to buy the land back from him. She's offered him far more than it's worth. But Lofty John won't sell, just for spite, seeing that he has a good farm of his own, and this piece isn't much good to him. He only pastures a few young cattle on it through the summer, and what was cleared is all growing up with scrub maple. It's a thorn in Elizabeth's side, and likely to be as long as Lofty John nurses his spite." "Why is he called Lofty John?" "Because he's a high and lofty fellow. But never mind him. I want to show you round my garden, Emily. It's mine. Elizabeth bosses the farm, but she lets me run the garden. To make up for pushing me into the well." "Did she do that?" "Yes. She didn't mean to, of course. We were just children. I was here on a visit, and the men were putting a new hood on the well and cleaning it. It was open, and we were playing tag around it. I made Elizabeth mad. Forget what I said. It wasn't hard to make her mad, you understand, and she made to give me a bang on the head. I saw it coming and stepped back to get out of the way, and down I went, head first. Don't remember anything more about it. There was nothing but mud at the bottom, but my head struck the stones at the side. I was took up for dead, my head all cut up. Poor Elizabeth was." Cousin Jimmy shook his head as if to intimate that it was impossible to describe how or what poor Elizabeth was. "I got about after a while, though, pretty near as good as new. Folks say I've never been quite right since, but they only say that because I'm a poet, and because nothing ever worries me. Poets are so scarce in Blairwater, folks don't understand them, and most people worry so much they think you're not right if you don't worry." There you go, that's the things I was talking about, except I couldn't remember how it had happened. "Won't you recite some of your poetry to me, Cousin Jimmy?" asked Emily eagerly. "When the spirit moves me, I will. It's no use to ask me when the spirit doesn't move me." "But how am I to know when the spirit moves you, Cousin Jimmy?" I'll begin of my own accord to recite my compositions, but I'll tell you this, the spirit generally moves me when I'm boiling the pig's potatoes in the fall. Remember that, and be around. Why don't you write your poetry down? Paper's too scarce at new moon. Elizabeth has some pet economies, and writing paper of any kind is one of them. But haven't you any money of your own, Cousin Jimmy? Oh, Elizabeth pays me good wages, but she puts all my money in the bank and just doles out a few dollars to me once in a while. She says I'm not fit to be trusted with money. When I came here to work for her, she paid me my wages at the end of the month, and I started for Shrewsbury to put it in the bank. I met a tramp on the road, a poor forlorn creature without a cent. I gave him the money. Why not? I had a good home and a steady job and clothes enough to do me for years. I suppose it was the foolishest thing I ever did, and the nicest. But Elizabeth never got over it. She's managed my money ever since. But come you now, I'll show you my garden before I have to go and sow the turnips. The garden was a beautiful place, well worthy of Cousin Jimmy's pride. It seemed like a garden where no frost could wither or rough wind blow, a garden remembering 100 vanished summers. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? There was a high hedge of clipped spruce all around it, spaced at intervals by tall Lombardies. Lombardy is a type of poplar. There you go. And very common in that region in France. Italy, Lombardy. I think that's Italy. I can't remember. Oh well. I should put on my descriptions that I pull faces too, shouldn't I? Yes. Right, carrying on. So you've got spruce trees and then you've got occasional poplar trees. The north side was closed in, the north side being the cold side, the one that the sun doesn't get on the other side of. There you go, all that sort of stuff. I'm explaining the north side because I live in New Zealand, which is in the southern hemisphere, which means that the sunny side of the house is the north side and the cold side of the house is the south side because the sun goes across the northern part of our sky. If you live in the northern hemisphere, then the southern side of the house is the sunny side and the northern side of the house is the shadowy side because the sun travels across to the south of you. Go outside and have a look on a sunny day and see what it is for where you live. And if you live in the tropics, well, then it's just overhead and it's really, really hot all the time. There you go. Carrying on. The north side was closed in by a thick grove of spruce, against which a long row of peonies grew, their great red blossoms splendid against its darkness. One big spruce grew in the centre of the garden, and underneath it was a stone bench, made of flat shore stones, worn smooth by long polish of wind and wave. In the southeast corner was an enormous clump of lilacs, trimmed into the semblance of one large drooping-boughed tree, gloried over with purple. An old summer house covered with vines filled the southwest corner, and in the northwest corner there was a sundial of grey stone, placed just where the broad red walk that was bordered with striped grass, that's because the way it's mown, and that was bordered with striped grass and picked out with pink conches. Conch is a type of seashell. And it ran off into Lofty John's bush, this path. Emily had never seen a sundial before and hung over it enraptured. Your great-great-grandfather, Hugh Murray, had that brought out from the old country, said Cousin Jimmy. There isn't as fine a one in the Maritime Provinces. There you go! I was right, the Maritime Provinces. There you go! I got it! I managed to remember something. Sorry, carrying on. There isn't as fine a one in the Maritime Provinces, and Uncle George Murray brought those conches from the Indies. He was a sea captain. Emily looked about her with delight. The garden was lovely and the house quite splendid to her childish eyes. It had a big front porch with Grecian columns. These were thought very elegant in Blairwater, and went far to justify the Murray pride. A schoolmaster had said they gave the house a classical air. To be sure, the classical effect was just now rather smothered in hop vines that rioted over the whole porch and hung in pale green festoons above the rows of potted scarlet geraniums that flanked the steps. Emily's heart swelled with pride. "It's a noble house," she said. "And what about my garden?" demanded Cousin Jimmy jealously. "It's fit for a queen," said Emily gravely and sincerely. Cousin Jimmy nodded, well pleased, and then a strange sound crept into his voice and an odd look into his eye. "There's a spell woven round this garden. The blight shall spare it, and the green worm pass it by. Drought dares not invade it, and the rain comes here gently." Emily took an involuntary step backward. She almost felt like running away. But now Cousin Jimmy was himself again. "Isn't this grass about the sundial like green velvet? I've taken some pains with it, I can tell you. You make yourself at home in this garden." Cousin Jimmy made a splendid gesture. "I confer the freedom of it upon you. Good luck to you, and may you find the lost diamond." "The lost diamond?" Emily said wonderingly. What fascinating thing was this? "Never hear the story? I'll tell it tomorrow. Sunday's lazy day at new moon. I must get off to my turnips now, or I'll have Elizabeth out looking at me. She won't say anything. She'll just look. Ever seen the real Murray look?" "I guess I saw it when Aunt Ruth pulled me out from under the table," said Emily ruefully. No, that was the Ruth Dutton look. Spite and malice and all uncharitableness. I hate Ruth Dutton. She laughs at my poetry. Not that she ever hears any of it. The spirit never moves when Ruth is around. Don't know where they got her. Elizabeth's a crank, but she's sound as a nut. And Laura's a saint, but Ruth's worm-eaten. As for the Murray look, you'll know it when you see it. It's as well known as the Murray pride. We're a darn queer lot. But we're the finest people ever happened. I'll tell you all about us tomorrow. Cousin Jimmy kept his promise while the aunts were away at church. It had been decided in family conclave that Emily was not to go to church that day. "She has nothing suitable to wear," said Aunt Elizabeth. "By next Sunday we shall have her white dress ready." Emily was disappointed that she was not to go to church. She had always found church very interesting on the rare occasions when she got there. It had been too far at Maywood for her father to walk, but sometimes Ellen Green's brother had taken her and Ellen. Ellen was the lady who was a cook and housekeeper for Emily and her father. "Do you think, Aunt Elizabeth," she said wistfully, "that God would be much offended if I wore my black dress to church? Of course, it's cheap. I think Ellen Green paid for it herself, but it covers me all up." "Little girls who do not understand things should hold their tongues," said Aunt Elizabeth. "I do not choose that Blairwater people should see my niece in such a dress as that wretched black merino. And if Ellen Green paid for it, we must repay her. You should have told us that before we came away from Maywood. No, you are not going to church today. You can wear the black dress to school tomorrow. We can cover it up with an apron." Emily resigned herself with a sigh of disappointment to staying home. But it was very pleasant after all. Cousin Jimmy took her for a walk to the pond, showed her the graveyard, and opened the book of yesterday for her. "Why are all the Murrays buried here?" asked Emily. "Is it really because they're too good to be buried with common people?" No, puss. We don't carry our pride as far as that. When old Hugh Murray settled at New Moon, there was nothing much but woods for miles, and no graveyards nearer than Charlottetown. That's why the old Murrays were buried here. And later on we kept it up because we wanted to lie with our own here on the green, green banks of the old Blairwater. "That sounds like a line out of a poem, Cousin Jimmy," said Emily. "So it is, out of one of my poems." I kind of like the idea of a exclusive burying ground like this, said Emily decidedly, looking around her approvingly at the velvet grass sloping down to the fairy blue pond, the neat walks, the well-kept graves. Cousin Jimmy chuckled. And yet they say you ain't a Murray, he said. Murray and Bird and Star and a dash of Shipley to boot. Or Cousin Jimmy Murray is much mistaken. So he's a cousin, not a brother, of the older generation. Shipley, said Emily. Yes, Hugh Murray's wife, your great-great-grandmother, was a Shipley, an Englishwoman. Ever hear how the Murrays came to New Moon? No. They were bound for Quebec. Hadn't any notion of coming to PEI, that's Prince Edward Island. They had a long, rough voyage and water got scarce, so the captain of the New Moon put in here to get some. Mary Murray had nearly died of seasickness coming out, never seemed to get her sea legs. So the captain, being sorry for her, told her she could go ashore with the men and feel solid ground under her feet for an hour or so. Very gladly she went, and when she got to shore she said, Here, I stay. And stay she did. Nothing could budge her. Old Hugh, he was young Hugh then, of course, he coaxed and stormed and raged and argued and even cried, I've been told, but Mary wouldn't be moved. In the end, he gave in and had his belongings landed and stayed too. So that is how the Murrays came to P.E. Island. I'm glad it happened like that, said Emily. So was old Hugh in the long run, and yet it rankled, Emily, it rankled. He never forgave his wife with a whole heart. Her grave is over there in the corner, that one with the flat red stone. Go you and have a look at it, and what he put on it. Emily ran curiously over. The big flat stone was inscribed with one of the long, discursive epitaphs of an older day, but beneath the epitaph was no scriptural verse or pious psalm. Clear and distinct, in spite of age and lichen, ran the line, Here I stay. That's how he got even with her, said Cousin Jimmy. He was a good husband to her, and she was a good wife, and bore him a fine family, and he was never the same after her death, but that rankled in him until it had to come out. Emily gave a little shiver. Somehow the idea of that grim old ancestor with his undying grudge against his nearest and dearest was rather terrifying. I'm glad I'm only half Murray, she said to herself. Aloud she said, Father told me it was a Murray tradition not to carry spite past the grave. So 'tis now, but it took its rise from this very thing. His family was so horrified at it, you see. It made considerable of a scandal. Some folks twisted it round to mean that old Hugh didn't believe in the resurrection, and there was talk of the session taking it up. But after a while the talk died away. The session is part of the governance of the church. Emily skipped over to another lichen-grown stone. Elizabeth Burnley. Who was she, Cousin Jimmy? Old William Murray's wife. He was Hugh's brother and came out here 5 years after Hugh did. His wife was a great beauty and had been a belle in the old country. That means a woman of beauty. A belle. Yes, you get some words and then some other words that have the same meaning, but we often use them together. And there's a special word for that. What's the word for it? Where you say something and then you say something else that means exactly the same thing as part of it. My words are gone today. Those sort of words, the explanation words. I've only got normal ones, sorry. I'll probably remember it halfway through the next sentence. She was she had been a belle in the old country. She didn't like the P.E. Island woods. She was homesick. Emily, scandalous homesick. For weeks after she came here, she wouldn't take off her bonnet, just walked to the floor in it, demanding to be taken back home. Didn't she take it off when she went to bed? Asked Emily. Dunno if she did go to bed. Anyway, William wouldn't take her back home, so in time she took off her bonnet and resigned herself. Her daughter married Hugh's son. So Elizabeth was your great-great-grandmother. Emily looked down at the sunken green grave and wondered if any homesick dreams haunted Elizabeth Burnley's slumber of 100 years. It's dreadful to be homesick, I know, she thought sympathetically. Little Stephen Murray is buried over there, said Cousin Jimmy. His was the first marble stone in the burying ground. He was your grandfather's brother, died when he was 12. He has, said Cousin Jimmy solemnly, become a Murray tradition. Why? He was so beautiful and clever and good. He hadn't a fault, so of course he couldn't live. They say there never was such a handsome child in the connection, and lovable, everybody loved him. He has been dead for 90 years. Not a Murray living today ever saw him, and yet we talk about him at family gatherings. He's more real than lots of living people. So you see, Emily, he must have been an extraordinary child, but it ended in that. Cousin Jimmy waved his hand towards the grassy grave and the white, prim headstone. I wonder, thought Emily, if anyone will remember me 90 years after I'm dead. Sorry. No, I don't think it's cat fluff this time, just one of my eyes feeling like it's got a little bit of gunk in it. Carrying on. I wonder, thought Emily, if anyone will remember me 90 years after I'm dead. This old yard is nearly full, reflected Cousin Jimmy. There's just room in yonder corner for Elizabeth and Laura and me. None for you, Emily. I don't want to be buried here, flashed Emily. I think it's splendid to have a graveyard like this in the family, but I am going to be buried in Charlottetown graveyard with Mother and Father. But there's one thing worries me, Cousin Jimmy. Do you think I'm likely to die of consumption? Cousin Jimmy looked judicially down into her eyes. No, he said. No, Miss Puss. You've got enough life in you to carry you far. You aren't meant for death. I feel that too, said Emily, nodding. And now, Cousin Jimmy, why is that house over there disappointed? Which one? Oh, Fred Clifford's house. Fred Clifford began to build that house 30 years ago. He was to be married and his lady picked out the plan, and when the house was just as far along as you see, she jilted him. Emily, right in the face of the day, she jilted him. Never another nail was driven in the house. Fred went out to British Columbia. He's living there yet, married and happy, but he won't sell that lot to anyone. So I reckon he feels the sting yet. I'm so sorry for that house, said Emily. I wish it had been finished. It wants to be. Even yet it wants to be. Well, I reckon it never will, said Jimmy. Fred had a bit of Shipley in him too, you see. One of old Hugh's girls was his grandmother, and Dr. Burnley up there in the big grey house has more than a bit. Is he a relation of ours too, Cousin Jimmy? 42nd cousin. Way back he had a cousin of Mary Shipley's for a great something. That was in the old country. His forebears came out here after we did. He's a good doctor, but an odd stick. Odder by far than I am, Emily. And yet nobody ever says he's not all there. Can you account for that? He doesn't believe in God, and I'm not such a fool as that. Not in any God, said Emily. Not in any God. He's an infidel, Emily, and he's bringing his little girl up the same way, which I think is a shame, Emily, said Cousin Jimmy confidentially. Doesn't her mother teach her things? Her mother is dead, answered Cousin Jimmy, with a little odd hesitation. Dead these 10 years, he added in a firmer tone. Ilse Burnley is a great girl. Hair like daffodils and eyes like yellow diamonds. Oh, Cousin Jimmy, you promised you'd tell me about the lost diamond, cried Emily eagerly. To be sure, to be sure. Well, it's there, somewhere in or about the old summer house, Emily. 50 years ago, Edward Murray and his wife came here from Kingsport for a visit. A great lady she was, and wearing silks and diamonds like a queen, though no beauty. She had a ring on with a stone in it that cost £200, Emily. That was a big lot of money to be wearing on one wee woman finger, wasn't it? It sparkled on her white hand as she held her dress, going up the steps of the summer house. But when she came down the steps, it was gone. And was it never found? Asked Emily breathlessly. Never, and for no lack of searching. Edward Murray wanted to have the house pulled down, but Uncle Archibald wouldn't hear of it because he had built it for his bride. The two brothers quarrelled over it and were never good friends again. Everybody in the connection has taken a spell hunting for the diamond. Most folks think it fell out of the summer house among the flowers or shrubs, but I know better, Emily. I know Miriam Murray's diamond is somewhere about that old house yet. On moonlit nights, Emily, I've seen it glinting and beckoning, but never in the same place, and when you go to it, it's gone, and you see it laughing at you from somewhere else. Again there was that eerie, indefinable something in Jimmy's voice or look that gave Emily a sudden crinkly feeling in her spine. But she loved the way he talked to her as if she were grown up, and she loved the beautiful land around her. And in spite of the ache for her father and the house in the hollow, which persisted all the time and hurt her so much at night that her pillow was wet with secret tears, she was beginning to be a little glad again in sunset and birdsong and early white stars, in moonlit nights and singing winds. She knew life was going to be wonderful here, wonderful and interesting, with outdoor cookhouses and cream-girdled dairies and pond paths and sundials and lost diamonds and disappointed houses and men who didn't believe in any God, not even Ellen Green's God. Emily hoped she would soon see Dr. Burnley. She was very curious to see what an infidel looked like, and she had already quite made up her mind that she would find the lost diamond. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm going to say, sorry, but that's going to be the end of reading today because the next one's another long one. Sorry about that. Anyway, so many possibilities and background on the family. Yay, at last. Well done, the author, for not giving us a huge, great info dump right at the very beginning of the book, but actually just drawing it out as Emily herself starts to get to know the family a little bit and wanting to know a little bit more of her own background. Have you ever had that happen where you discover a whole aspect of your family that you didn't know anything about? Not because it's been hidden from you deliberately, but just because you didn't know, so you didn't know to ask. Have you? Have you got family like that? My Canadian family I knew about. There were more of them than I realised just because I hadn't sat down and thought, okay, well, there's this relative and there's that relative, and they're all children of these relatives further up and all these other sorts of things like that. But I knew that they were there, and it's one of those things that it's always, not always in the back of my mind, but I'm just aware when I stop to think about family, because I'm very much involved with my immediate family here and my parents and my dad's side of the family, because the land I'm living on, no, not the actual land I'm living on, the area I'm living in is where my dad's family have lived for 150 years, I think, something like that. They came out from Scotland, and then they were in Pukekohe, which is south of Auckland, which is a semi-rural sort of an area. And now And we have a wonderful story about how we ended up on the land up here in Algiers Bay. But yes, family stories and family rabbit trails, even family connections that we don't necessarily grow up knowing, but we find out about them along the way. This is my special drink for today. This one is a New Zealand drink called lemon and pie raw from the fridge, although it's nearer to room temperature now, it's not too bad, with just a little splash of a locally made from one of the islands nearby peach liqueur, just a tiny little bit diluted into this whole glass. But very yummy, very refreshing actually. So, time for a snack. Time for you to do a bit of typing in the chat so I can talk to you. And did we find out what spirea, not spirea, what that plant was? I'm going to have a look. And see if I can find out what that plant is. Most of the other plants that he talked about, I know. Peonies are wonderful. They have these huge, great flowers. They're kind of like a double rose that's fairly loose, but they're bigger. And they look softer somehow. And the dark red ones are gorgeous, but they also have these beautiful white ones and blush pink ones. But where I live in New Zealand, the part of New Zealand I live in is too hot for them. They don't grow well up here. Because it gets too hot and it gets too humid and we get too much rain at the wrong time of year, or it's not predictable enough or something like that. But they just don't grow. Not up our way anyway. But we had some growing through the fence when we lived in England, when we were living on the farm, which was lovely. It was one of those dark red ones, but it was a low shrub. No, I can't remember what it was called. Let's go back and see if we can find that description of the garden. No, it's all the description of the people that came after the garden. That's the house. Summer house. The summer house is the one where the diamond went missing, isn't it? So we might explore that a little bit more and further through the book. Now here we have the description of the garden. I'm just going to skim through. There's the high hedge of spruce and the Lombardy poplars, just called Lombardies in the book. I happen to know that that's what they are. The peonies and a big spruce in the middle of the peony garden with a stone bench. Lilac. Now my eyes are just jumping ahead. I have ADHD, and sometimes I do really well with following through on a thought, and other times my brain will just go bing, 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 and bounce along between things. And I can't find that word. It must have been one before that, but I can't find it. Where is it? I really wanted to know what that word was. No, I cannot find it. Anyway, so have you looked at where Prince Edward Island is? And I know that Shadow hasn't been there because they said so. But have any of my other listeners been there? Did you even know it existed? In fact, I think I have a map of it. This is Prince Edward Island. Here. Down like this. This is Prince Edward Island. This. And here, behind my elbow, that is New Brunswick. And that's the island. It's quite big, as you can see. And I will just find the other map picture because the other map picture shows you where it is in Canada. Map. Here it is. And I'll even use the one with the circle on this time, which I didn't use last time. Here we go. So this is Nova Scotia. This bit that goes up here, that's Nova Scotia. This is this here, this blob. There. That blob under my hand, that's New Brunswick. And this is America. Did you know that? That I think, but I'm not sure, maybe Maine. And that, guess what that is? Newfoundland. That's a huge island. Technically, it's an island. And then that's Prince Edward Island there. It's kind of caught in the cup between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And one of the funny things is there is a New Glasgow here in Nova Scotia. And there's also a New Glasgow or New Glasgow, depending on your accent, whether you're Canadian or if you're New Zealand or English or Scottish even. They have one on Prince Edward Island as well, just to confuse everybody. I'm sure they do it on purpose. No, actually, the main reason that places have names in common with other places is because they've both been named after yet another place. So, named after Glasgow in Scotland. There you go. New York, the really famous city in North America and in America on the east coast of America, is named after a city called York in England. There you go. Apparently Hollywood is too, named after a little village in England. Not a great big city, but a little village or town. Something like that, anyway. All sorts of things. I love finding out these connections. Sometimes it's because people who settled somewhere or had a lot of influence in the place that they were moving to had come from a particular place, and so they named it after somewhere that was important to them. And sometimes it's because it's named after a family connection. So the town that I live just near, it's named after a small town in England, in the northeast of England. Within it, it has street names that are after families and nearby places that the original in England have near it. So local family surnames and also surrounding towns and villages were used as names for streets within the town that I live near. Which is quite funny because there's a street called Annick Street, which anyone who's not grown up in the area always mispronounces. But Annick is a much, much bigger place than Warkworth in England. Annick, written Alnwick, but pronounced Annick correctly, has a big castle, this famous big castle that the Percys, who were landholders and lords and things like this, had, and they'd lived in it, and it's still big and it's still fancy, and it was all their region. So that was their base. And then you've got Warkworth, tiny little Warkworth, little town built on this river called the Coquette River, and that's what we've got as a street name of one of the places in town, our town. We've also got a castle, but in the English Warkworth, but it's in ruins. It was also one of the Percy castles, I think, but it was just not one that it was not one that worked well as a living place later on when they were in a more peaceful state. And so, because it was not as spread out and luxurious and all this sort of stuff, it was just like, well, it got stones thrown at it by the invaders, by the people who are opposing us, and it's like it's cold and it's drafty, and it's like it's going to cost us too much to look after it, so we'll just let it go. It can be a ruin. You can go and have a look at the rocks if you want. You can take some rocks home with you if you want, but it's like, no, we're not interested anymore. We've got this lovely luxury castle over here that we're living in. And so it's quite common for people over there in that Warkworth to have visitors from my Warkworth, the Warkworth that I live at, go visiting over there and having a look and going, oh, now I know what that name comes from, and now I know what that comes from, and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know if you've realised that there's a lot of places in the world that are named after other places in the world, but also after people. The place that I actually live in, near the town, is named after the family because the family bought it and farmed it. So there you go. Just quirky little things like that. Do you have any interesting stories like that in your family background? Do you have a place that your whole family moved to? Did they pack up and move from Scotland, England, Ireland, France, Italy, India, China, wherever? Did all your family pack up and move to another country for some reason? Or have you come from a family where one or two of you left and everybody else is still there, and you may or may not ever see each other? You may or may not have anything to do with each other. My husband's family, most of them are still over in Europe, and his parents came out to New Zealand because after the Second World War, nobody wanted to live in the particular city that they'd been living in because it was just like flat from being bombed, because the Germans had taken over, and then the Allies had been trying to liberate it, so therefore they had to try and do damage to what the Germans were up to stop them. And then once the Germans were dealt with, it's like, okay, well, what about our city? Now we've got to rebuild it. What are we going to do? And some of them just decided, I'm in my 20s. I don't really look forward to a life that's going to be just living in the making do and trying to get things going again. I want to go somewhere else and live with a fresh new, for me, world around me. And so they did. They packed up, picked up all their stuff and moved. And so now they're in New Zealand, some of them. But that was only one part of the family. The rest of them stayed over there. I've been and visited them. Families are interesting. We've all come from somewhere. Most of us, it's not the place that we currently live in. There are some who are still living in the same place after multiple generations. Now, I mean, I live in the same bay that I don't know how many generations of my family have lived in, but we know when we came here, it was just over 150 years ago, which compared with other parts of the world, that's not very much. But for New Zealand, that's a long time to have your family living in the same area and living on the same piece of land for that long. My children are the 7th generation to have lived on the land that we live on as a family. Not the bit that we're currently living on, but the other end of the bay. But they've lived down there. And that's just unheard of for a lot of New Zealand because it's such a young country. And there's pluses and minuses for young countries. Your systems, you can build them the way you want them. You can do things differently. Usually if it's a young country, it's not necessarily huge. The population is still expanding. It's still growing. If you come from an old country, there's lots of wonderful history. There's lots of things you can go and look at and stuff like that. But it can also be very frustrating because if things need change, it takes a very, very, very long time for change to happen. That's just the way the world works. Anyway, so there you go. Enough rambling. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for being part of the experience of Emily of New Moon by Lucy Maud Montgomery. And we shall have more next time, which will probably, it should be on Wednesday, if there's nothing else happens with my family. Like I say, my mum's just gone into care. If there's other things I have to do, I will put pause onto the storytelling, story reading, but otherwise I'll be here unless it's something major. Don't intend there to be. I will give you my YouTube link, even though technically it's actually on my channel here on Twitch. If you're over on YouTube already watching this after the time I read it, and you want to be part of me reading a story live, because it's a different experience than just listening, because you can actually type in the chat and interact with me, and I can comment on the things that you're talking about, and you can comment on the things that I'm talking about. It can make it a lot more fun. If you want to do that sort of thing, then head on over, find my link, which is somewhere on my YouTube page, and head on over to Twitch. Twitch will show you when I am likely to be live reading again. Put that in your phone or on your diary, write a note on your hand, tattoo it on your forehead. I don't mind, whatever does it for you. And I look forward to meeting you and seeing you there next time, whenever that is. And for those who are on Twitch again, these stories are going over to YouTube in 2 weeks' time. So if you ever want to catch up on bits that you've missed, they're 2 weeks afterwards. Anyway, great to have you here. Lovely to have your input. Good to spend some time together with friends. Thanks for being here. And happy reading in the meantime, between now and when I see you next. May you have many lovely words to read. Thanks and bye.